Hello, and welcome to this special interview episode of It's a Fandom Thing. I am very excited to be sitting down today to speak with head of content, at Wattpad, Alessandra Ferreri, who is also the resident fanthropologist, quote unquote, is what I was told. So, hello, Alessandra. Thank you so much for sitting down with me.
Hi, Erin. Thanks for having me.
Of course. And if you want to give just a little bit of a background and sort of what that means, what the head of content and also that fanthropologist, how you might define that too.
Yeah, of course. Well, I've been at Wattpad since 2015, and I started working out in community management in particular, really getting to understand who our writers were and what they were writing just right from the get-go. I moved into more content strategy. I started working on our Wattpad studio when it started up and did a lot of acquisitions there for entertainment and, of course, for publishing. And now I get to lead a team of incredible content experts that track trends and analytics for the organization. So that's kind of where the fanthropology lens comes in, where we really want to mix kind of or look at a anthropological view of fan behavior on Wattpad specifically, and then how it relates to, fandom externally as well.
That's so fascinating because I think, part of the reason I wanted to start my podcast was to give a little bit more respect to fandom culture, especially
Mhm.
women in fandom. And so having that be almost like this scientific aspect of it or part of it is really cool. I really love that. That lends also, I think, some more validity. Do you feel that way as well?
Totally. And I also have to say I'm not like the first or only one. I did not
Yeah.
make up fanthropology as a term. There are so many incredible analysts out there that are doing work in this space because like you said, fandom culture is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and there's so much history behind it. And so I get to provide kind of the Wattpad slice of what this kind of looks like. And it's such a wonderful place to explore because it's always changing and there's always something interesting to dive into.
Yeah. Awesome. Wonderful. Well, let's get into some fanfic because we're going to discuss a lot of fanfic because, of
Nice.
course, I'm sure people listening, most of our listeners are familiar with fanfic. And that Wattpad was one of the first places where fanfic was, right? Was found, was there, was one of the
Yeah,
first,
kind of. I would
kind
say
of.
like it was more Wattpad started in 2006, which if you think about what was going on in 2006, Tumblr was just
Mhm.
starting and AO3 was like almost starting. So all these social fanfic platforms or places where fans were converging were really just starting up. And so Wattpad was one of those spaces online where you could go on and write fan fiction. It came kind of at the heels of when LiveJournal was really kind of downsizing as a fanfic platform. The event is called Strike Through, as I'm sure fandom people remember that time. And so Wattpad kind of appeared in that space when, people that were writing fan fiction and that were engaging in fandom were looking for a place to go. And funnily enough, like that's not what Wattpad was actually built to do. It was actually built to be an app where you could read on your phone. So also like flip phones and smartphones, like this is like really when that was getting started as well. And it was like, oh, we have this technology we can carry around in our hands. What if we could read on it? So that was really the original premise, but it really quickly became a space for fandom. And so way back in those early days, the founders were like, what do we do with fan fiction? Like, what is that? And then quickly kind of just, rapidly started to understand it, brought in some experts and then, 20 years later, here we are, a really foundational fan fiction space.
Yeah. Yeah, I think still people are like, what is fanfic?
Yeah.
And people are discovering it still. So why do you think fanfic has had such a lasting impact on various fandoms?
Yeah, I mean, fan fiction, which is, writing, the what ifs of based on, properties and characters, et cetera, it really just lets fans become part of the story. You can add in your perspective and kind of flex your creative muscles, whether that's as a fan or as an expert in a property as well. Like if you know everything about Jurassic Park, you could probably write a pretty cool perspective on that, which is non-canonical, but it becomes, your fan perspective. So it makes fandom really participatory. It puts you right into the middle of the action and allows you to connect around the things that you love with other people who also love it. And I think that alone is just really fun. And of course, it has a lasting impact on fandom because fandom is at its core participatory as well. I am part of a fandom. I am actively, engaging with others in this space or engaging with this material. And so fan fiction, kind of like fan art, is a way for you to kind of put your own creative stamp into that fandom. And I think what's lovely about it too is that, I mean, the lasting impact is all about community building too, right? You don't have fan fiction or fandom without community. And so being able to interact with other fans, like you really do build those relationships up by, you know, creating your ideas, expanding on your concepts, all of that stuff. It's fun at the end of the day. So I think that lasting impact comes from the joy that really comes from playing around in that fandom sandbox.
Yeah, and I think of course, if you have like an ending to a show that you didn't like, the fixing it with fanfic, or if there's a ship, which there's two pairings, there's a pairing that you don't get to see, being
Mhm.
able to write them through fanfic, I think, yeah.
Yeah, it's such a jumping off point, I think, for your own creative ideas. And you think, I mean, we're always kind of inspired by things around us, right? You always, especially when you're a writer in any capacity, you're like, write what you know. And
Mhm.
sometimes the things that you know really well are the things that you love the most. And sometimes that is, a TV show or a movie or an album or whatever that may be. And so, of course, coming in it as from like a gateway perspective of like, oh, I have this great idea. What if this movie ended this way instead, or this character got with this character instead? I think those are really fun ways to just explore fandom in your own way. And obviously, fan fiction is a key driver of that.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Um, so how do you think Wattpad has helped fans find like a community?
Well, Wattpad in and of itself is a social platform, right?
Yeah,
So it's
yeah.
it's like a social storytelling app is how I like to describe it. And so it makes storytelling really communal. It invites users and like fans, readers, friends, whatever, into the process with you and with writing. And so, of course, like community is at the foundation of everything that we do. It's just amazing to watch how people find each other and find things that they love and then get inspired by one another. And you see that ripple effect happen on platforms like Wattpad. It makes storytelling really dynamic as well because when you are engaging with a community, you can bounce ideas off each other, or you see like, oh, a bunch of people commented on this. I'm going to do more of this or less of this. So it makes the storytelling process and the storytelling creation process really dynamic because you're engaging with others. You're not sitting alone at your computer without any input. You're kind of in a community space already. So you get that, back and forth right from like the earliest days. Um, so yeah, I think that that's the main thing. And just like also how it's built, the architecture of Wattpad, you can follow people, you can add stories to your library. All of that is in pursuit of building community as well. So that we kind of like try to create the experience of community and then also allow people to engage with one another as easily as possible.
Yeah, and I think that's what's been so amazing about social media anyway
Mhm.
is finding that community, and especially with younger generations growing up on it. So it's a lot like they're always trying to find new spaces to find that community at. So
For
yeah.
sure.
And how do you think fan fiction has changed though from the early days until today? I
Mm.
know it's kind of a broad question, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that, the way that we create and communicate with each other is always tied to the technology that we have available to us. So obviously you think of like, for instance, the last 20, 30 years of the internet in general. Of course, that's evolved and fan fiction has been in part of that evolution as well. I mean, firstly, I do think that fan fiction is so much more accessible and also kind of prolific. Fandom culture in general has kind of never, it's the dominant culture as of now, I would say. Like everybody's talking about fandoms, fandom culture, all of our marketing, all of our like everything is all about fandom. Whereas I would even say, 5, 10 years ago is much more on the fringes of fandom culture, like being like an avid fan of things. It wasn't really at the center of entertainment necessarily, but now it has moved very much into that starring role, which I think is great. And connected to that, it means that fan fiction obviously gets more recognition because when sometimes for some people, when you're in fandom, you write fan fiction. And so it's just become so much more prolific. Um, I also think, the format for fan fiction has evolved so much. I talked about, 20 years ago with Wattpad coming up into the social media space as a container for fandom. Um, Prior to that, we're looking at like fan fiction were built in like actual tangible zines, right? Like they were like in physical media. And then that would have moved on to like forums or mailing lists. And then all of a sudden you see them on websites like LiveJournal, for instance. And then suddenly they're on in this social media landscape as well. So all of that has kind of changed the format of fan fiction, like how it's written and how people engage with it. If you were just working with a zine, it would be like who is in your vicinity, like who's in your neighborhood that you can give that zine to. Whereas now you're on social media, you can connect and read fan fiction from someone halfway across the world. So it's just a very different landscape for that. And that has come from the evolution of how we just in general connect and communicate with one another and how that technology has allowed us to do that. Um, I think the last thing that I was thinking about when it comes to how fan fiction has evolved is also, I think it's a little bit more parasocial as well. Because I think when you think about social media and how much we can, we have access to everything and everyone all the time, like just genuinely all the time, especially like celebrity culture and, popular figures, which tend to be a pretty popular part of fandom and fan fiction. And so I think that adoption of parasocial sensibilities, I think, has also kind of helped fan fiction evolve in certain ways. Real person fiction, even when I started at Wattpad, it wasn't a super popular thing, but it has become more and more popular in these spaces just by how we interact with, the figures that we have access to. So many ways, and in short, many, many ways, fan fiction has evolved, but
Yeah.
at its core, it's still that community driven, creative, social outlet, I think, for fans.
Yeah. And that parasocial thing that you were mentioning, I mean, fanfic used to kind of be like this secret in a way where
Mhm.
you kind of just knew that was something you weren't supposed to bring up in general interactions with like the actors or anything or the creators or anything like that. Like it was like supposed to be very separate. And I've found it, I don't know if you agree with this, that has changed a lot. Like you get a lot of fandoms where it seems like even the people, the actors and everything know about fanfic already. I found that a lot with Supernatural, but I don't know if you
Mhm.
see it with other fandoms as well.
Yeah, I definitely think that's evolved. I think that the fourth wall breaking is very it's thinner than it's ever been in a way. I think, but that also kind of comes down to just again how much access we have. If you think about, the people that have grown up online and on forums, think about like Olivia Rodrigo talking about the Harry Styles fan fiction she used to write. So even people that are becoming figures that people want to incorporate in their fandom or fan fiction are ones that also grew up in fandom. So we're kind of seeing this
That's
like, this loop where, everything's kind of overlapping on one another. It's not so separate anymore. So I think that just because of how prolific fan fiction is and has been for a while, it makes it a bit, people know that it exists and know that, there might be those spaces. Whereas maybe a little while ago, you didn't have that much. It was still more on the fringes, right? So it's right kind of smack in the middle of the conversation sometimes. But yeah, I think like the fourth wall breaking thing is always going to be a bit of a contentious subject. I think it really comes down to the way I look at it, at least as someone at Wattpad, is, it's always, you always want to make sure that the creator themselves are comfortable if they want to share something like,
yeah.
or they're open for that kind of thing. That's kind of their prerogative. But ultimately, fan fiction and fan works are by fans for fans. They're not really for the subjects that they're being written about because, that kind of that makes that wall very thin and can kind of, I think, change the experience in a way. So that's but it really just comes down to personal preference.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, yeah, it can get complicated, I think, too,
Mhm.
when it comes to that. Cause I know there's been a lot of stuff like being involved in fandoms where it is like, why did you bring that up? You shouldn't bring that up, or that kind of stuff, you know. And if it
Yeah,
makes the person uncomfortable too, because that's gotta be
totally.
a
I
little
think we
weird.
all, yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Like when it comes to fan fiction, it's fiction and
Yeah.
it remains fiction at the end of the day. So there really is not a ton of benefit to just bringing the person in, who it might be about. I think it's nice to just let your creativity, sing on its own with the fans and the people that it's meant for. It's not really meant necessarily for, the subject matter.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. Um, why do you think fan fiction, like right now, like you mentioned, it's having like it's getting a little bit more mainstream. Why do
Mhm.
you think that's happening right now? Is it just because of the proliferation in social media, or do you think there's something else happening?
I think that's a big part for sure. I think there are many more places to kind of shout your interest from the rooftops. There's so many channels that we can talk about what we like in person, but also on social media. Um, there's just so many avenues to talk about that stuff. And also I find like even myself or, the whole fanthropology lens, like there's so many more experts in this space that are talking about fandom as a whole, not just like individual aspects of it, but just like wow, fandom really is driving so much of our entertainment culture and our, media in general. So obviously that's like a huge thing of why it's becoming more mainstream. But I also think going back to what I said a little bit earlier is there are so many people. I mean, look at the history of just Wattpad as one example. We have 20 years here. People who grew up in fan spaces are now occupying spaces in entertainment and in publishing and in
Mm-hmm.
development, and they're maybe in the rooms making creative decisions based on the things that were really foundational to them. And in some cases, that might have been fan fiction. So I think that moving into, as we, culture keeps evolving, things that become mainstream are coming from the decisions that are being made in various, writers' rooms and things, and they're being inspired by, the previous round of media in some way. And in some cases, that would have been fan fiction. So if you grew up reading fan fiction and then now you are, a head writer of a TV show or something, there might be these like, oh, I loved this kind of trope, or I really was into this dynamic and I want to bring a version of that into what we're doing now. I think there's a lot of like you can like pay homage to a lot of those things. So I think that's kind of definitely contributing to the mainstream aspects of fan fiction.
And I think also what you said made me think of this. I think fanfic, I still don't think it's the respect it deserves as far as like the
Mm.
level and the quality of the writing. Because I think people still think of it as something like, that's not very, there's not much quality to it. And I've
Mhm.
read some fanfic that is better than some novels I've read. And so do you think though, because that just made me think of that, because if you've got people that have written fanfic and then they're in writers' rooms of like a
Mhm.
television show, do you think because of there being that kind of jumping off point almost, it seems like, do you think that that's another way is that people are getting more respect like for the writing and stuff in fanfic?
That's a good question. I think that it's kind of a good thing and a bad thing at the same time where people are like underestimating the power of fan fiction. I agree with you. The fan fiction that I've read has sometimes been the most devastating, incredible fiction I've ever read. And I think but I think part of that is because it's fan fiction. I think sometimes when you create a more traditional expectation for works, it can change the shape of them. I mean, think about the publishing industry in general. There's a very specific formula for what works, very specific BISAC codes, very specific, formulas for like a hero's journey or a narrative arc or whatever that,
Mhm.
or even a length of a story, like you're probably not going to get a you know 10,000 word story like novel, right? Like you're not just not going to like lug that around like to read it, but in fan fiction you can have any kind of formula that you want, and that's kind of the beauty of it. And so I feel very protective of having these spaces where I think fan spaces are necessary, where not everything has to be commercialized, not everything has to be um created to be mainstream. I think it's really nice to have these alternative spaces where storytelling can just thrive in a way, and then those can influence, what becomes mainstream down the line. Um, but yeah, there's a level of like obviously I think that writing should be respected and absolutely is like some of the most incredible stuff ever, but give it some breathing room to just be what it is. It doesn't have to be too formulaic, or we don't have to, make it something that it doesn't have to be. Let it be like a sandbox, a creative sandbox with spaces. So, yeah, I think there's an interesting kind of like catch 22 there that I think, and this is also coming from somebody who works in online digital storytelling communities where we want that raw creative energy to exist and to continue to thrive. I don't want to be prescriptive to tell, writers how to write or what is, the best formula to make them more respectable as a writer. I want them to kind of like follow that journey and that creative spark, because that is in most cases where the next phenomenon will come from. But you kind of have to let it be messy sometimes too, in order to like get to that end goal at some point. So yeah, so I mean, I agree with you though. I think fan fiction in general should be respected, but I think the respect comes from like letting it be a space for exploration and a space for that can live alongside traditional spaces, but it doesn't necessarily have to follow those same rules or formulas.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense, especially when you're talking about why certain fanfics could be so devastating, because it
Hmm.
is in within that world that you're already familiar with and you're already know the characters from. And so if you have them going through something devastating, then it can feel kind of like even more emotional, probably because you're already attached to them anyway. So
Totally.
putting,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Yeah. And have the most popular fandoms in the fanfic realm changed over the years? Or are there particular fandoms that have remained like the most popular?
Yeah, I mean, speaking specifically from a Wattpad lens anyway, I think based on at least the data that I have access to, we do see some pretty consistent fandoms. We see kind of like the big ones remaining to stay pretty big, like the big franchises. We tend to see those like, they have staying power. At least when you're looking from the top down. So you're kind of looking at it from a high level, like, oh yeah, here are the big ones that are still very, very big. Um, and I also think part of that is because, they have that staying power. They've been around for years and years and years. If you think about K-pop is such a big one, or something like a Harry Potter. Those ones just have like so much material to work with and just such a long-standing legacy in fan spaces. But I also think like we do try to track new kind of up and coming things just to see, especially newer ones. And obviously you can have breakouts like something like Heated Rivalry will come out of nowhere and suddenly it starts to solidify itself. Um, but I think there's a mix of both. So you have like your long-standing legacy fandoms that continue to kind of just be comfortable places that people go back to and that they love. And then you also have the newer fandoms that come up. And I think those ones tend to be based on, at least from our angle, consistent interest in newer fandoms come from consistent output. So let's say it's like an ongoing series that has a new season that comes out. We generally will see a spike in interest as the new season is airing, and then it will peter off as there's like that downtime. So as things kind of like come more and more, you get more material, like a new album comes out, or a new season comes out, or a new sequel, you kind of will see that interest peak over and over until it solidifies itself as like a mainstay sort of fandom. I think that's why K-pop fandom is so prolific because you think about how much material is coming out from so many of these bands. You're like, oh my God, there's always something new to absorb and be inspired by. And so that's one that we see that's been growing pretty consistently and hasn't really slowed down.
Yeah, and I'm sure also with K-pop Demon Hunters and the success of that probably
Hmm.
also added to it too. Because I know there are a lot of people that didn't listen to K-pop that discovered it through that.
Totally.
Yeah, and then branched out and discovered other K-pop. So
Yeah.
yeah. And do you think though, that has me curious because you're talking about, ongoing properties. Do you think also though streaming might have something to do with it? Like if a show that hasn't been on streaming before or it goes to a new streaming platform, like I know with Supernatural, they used to be on Netflix and now they're on
Mhm.
Peacock. And so changing those platforms and having new people discover them, do you ever find that that does a spike in something that's like maybe an older fandom that all of a sudden you've got a spike in fanfic?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'd have to look into it, but I think that the premise makes sense. Like usually
Yeah.
it's like access, right? So, oh, I was watching, I think a lot of like rewatch culture is quite um popular. So it's like I want to rewatch my comfort shows over and over and over again. The thing that's different about that though is that you're not seeing a lot of newer shows get the longevity that older shows are getting.
Mm,
So we're not really in an era where you're going to get, 10 plus seasons of a show anymore. You get maybe
true.
one or two and then it gets canceled or something. So I think part of that is also rewatch culture is based on these older shows because they actually had the room and the time to breathe and get a lot of material, and now they're just bouncing around the streaming services. So, yes, I would say that, having access to shows like Supernatural or a Gilmore Girls or whatever it may be, and having that as like, oh, I can always tap into that will bring in new fans over time. But what's interesting, and I think what will be a fascinating thing to track, is whether or not other shows that don't have the same amount of material are going to have that type of impact.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That makes sense because you also have shows that they'll have one season and then there'll be like 3 years in between seasons. So
Yeah.
it's like how is that longevity going to last? And seasons being shorter and everything being dropped all at once instead of the weekly format. So
Hmm.
yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, we saw that actually with Stranger Things. So I found that
Yeah.
the last season of Stranger Things really saw like a massive spike on Wattpad, and there's so many reasons for that. Obviously, there's like, the this conspiracy theory at the end where there was going to be a
Yeah.
last episode. There's obviously that's feeding into it. Of course, there was the Byler shipping. There's a whole bunch of stuff that kind of contributes obviously to that. But I think that that was the last one that I saw that really kind of had been on for a long time, and that last season spike was definitely something that we noted.
Yeah, that would make sense, especially with that one, especially like you said, all those conspiracy theories that there was
Hmm.
some missing episode that was going to come out. Yeah. Yeah. Do you think fanfic? I mean, we already kind of touched on this, but so I know that you're probably going to say yes to this, but do you think, even though it's getting more respect, do you think it still deserves more respect than it is getting?
Yeah, I mean, always. I think that unfortunately, when we are talking about spaces that are predominantly celebrated by women in most cases, they tend to be disrespected
Yeah.
more than others. Like you think about sports fandom versus like boy band fandom, for instance, is like such a perfect example of like, oh, it's totally okay to like light a car on fire, but it's not okay to scream your lungs out at your favorite boy band. So I get that. So in general, absolutely. Like you said earlier, like it's very easy to disregard fan fiction as being weird or inappropriate or like asking those questions like, why would you want to do that? But that just, I think, misunderstands the whole point, the whole like community aspect and the creativity aspect, and just like the participatory nature of what fan fiction provides and the space that it offers people, especially like really getting to connect over the things that you love and the joy that it is. I think that deserves so much respect. I do think there's things around fan fiction and fandom culture that can verge on the problematic, which can feed into those misunderstandings, like parasocial relationships. We talked
Mm-hmm.
about conspiracy theories that lead to toxic fan bases. I think all of that can kind of help feed into that idea where like, what is this? Like, this is so weird, whatever. But overall, as a creative format, a way of writing and expressing yourself that is absolutely worthy of respect. For sure, hands down.
Yeah. Yeah. And the fandom wars and the infighting
Hmm.
can, detract from that at times. But it's true. I think, sports fans don't really, I think, like to still acknowledge that they're part of a fandom too. It's still
Totally.
part of a fan, it's still a
Yeah.
fandom. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, like I mean I'm from Toronto, and so the Blue Jays just came off of their little World Series run last year, and that just like really exploded that fan base and the fandom and around Toronto sports, and it was just so amazing to watch that. But also like I was like, I recognize this. Like this is such a
Mhm.
thing that I know I've seen it in, the One Direction fandom or in other spaces that are like not the same kind of media, not the same things that we're observing, but it's the same reaction, the same emotional, um, and often creative kind of approach to this type of thing. It is like you love what you love and you should celebrate it in some way, regardless of, what industry it comes from.
Yeah. As long as you're not harming anyone, I
Yeah,
mean, have fun. We need to find joy where we can find joy for sure. So,
totally.
yeah. Yeah. How has fandom culture changed, do you think, with the onslaught? We've discussed it a little bit, but with the
Hmm.
onslaught of different social media and how social media has even changed. Like there was Tumblr time, and then which Tumblr's still there, but it's still not as big a juggernaut, I don't think, as
Hmm.
it used to be. So how do you think that has kind of changed how fandom interacts and even fanfic?
Yeah, I just think it's so much more prolific. Like just across the board, it is rare to find someone who doesn't know fan fiction is a thing or that doesn't isn't belonging or understanding of the concept of fandom. Even if they might not necessarily identify as being a part of a fandom, they definitely know what that kind of means. And so I think conversations around fandom and just how it's just so much more prolific. It can genuinely happen everywhere. You can have conversations in person, you can have them online, you can go to spaces like fandom events and like thematic things are happening, cosplay and, fan art and just like how we celebrate and absorb the stuff that we love in media is just so much more prolific, like I said, over and over. Um, you can connect with I can find a fan of the same thing that I love just by like clicking on a certain like on someone's page. Whereas before you
Yeah.
might have had to like hunt them down or just like it was by a fluke or maybe even way back when it was like, oh, my older brother's friend had brought a CD over and now I'm in this fandom or whatever it was. Like, it was a much more kind of analog. It was harder to do, whereas now it's so much easier for fans and interest to converge in some way. And that means that fandoms can grow faster, obviously. I think that also means that, at least kind of what I'm seeing is that sometimes fandom can get conflated with just like marketing and promotion. It's just like, oh my
That's
gosh, look at
true.
this stuff. And like, just because we're promoting something and it gets engagement or that something is, you know, popular for a time, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's built out a fandom that will follow it through various sequels or various stages, or will go to a platform and write fan fiction about it. I think that distinction is pretty important too. I think sometimes it's easy to take fandom for granted of just being like, oh, everything's a fandom, but like not everything is a fandom, when you think about it, but from like the very beginning of our conversation, it's like fandom is participatory. It's how we're participating in it, and it means that the fans are participating in it.
Mhm.
So and not everything has that, and that's not a bad thing. Not everything needs to have that. It's a pretty like intense commitment to something. But I do think that like fandom culture sometimes gets conflated with, just general media entertainment. And I like to be like, but like, does it have a fandom? It can have fans, might have a fan base. Does it have a fandom? It's my question all the time.
No, that's a good way to look at it. And I think maybe, I don't know if you agree, it might also be being conflated because of influencer culture. Because you have so
Yeah.
many influencers now, like going to, I know for film critics, it's been very hard for them because you have so
hmm
many influencers doing that now or being invited to those before the film critics are being invited to like premieres and stuff like that. Do you think maybe that's part of it too, is the influencer culture with fandom getting kind of conflated together or?
Yeah, it could. I mean, I also just think if I think of even myself as a fan and as
Mhm.
being a part, like it is a commitment. Like you are putting so much
Yeah.
time and energy and, and money in most cases into some space. It's hard to do that across like a whole breadth of things. Like that would just be, I mean, it's amazing if you can, but it takes a lot of time as well. So I think like, yeah, I think marketing in general is also very prolific. There's just like so much content to consume. It's harder to get into a fandom or at least have kind of a long-standing, tenure because, things change so quickly and trends come in and out and everything is like we just have so much to consume. So yeah, so I think it's evolving from that perspective. It'll be interesting to see what we do, whether it's like the long-standing legacy fandoms are the ones that endure, or if other ones start to replace it, or if it's just something that we just move so quickly through our interests and we just change over time. I mean, I think you can say the same thing about like fashion trends. I was
Yeah.
paying attention to some of that where it's like, oh, things are trending for like a couple weeks and then it's on to the next thing, on to the next thing where but because we have access to so much information, of course we're gonna move through it so much more quickly. We could just literally scroll through everything. So that will, I think, for sure have an impact on fandom culture or how we describe it. But that's like yet to be seen. We'll have to keep track.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true. Yeah, it's and the legacy fandoms, like I truly do believe, and I keep bringing it up because it's part of the reason this podcast exists, is the supernatural fandom. And you
Yeah.
find younger generations are now just discovering it, like
hmm
people that weren't even like born when the show
Yeah.
premiered. So it is pretty amazing how that happens, where you have new people discovering it and seeing it from a different lens. And then you have the people that have been there forever. And then you've got the fandom gatekeeping that goes on too, where
Yeah.
it's like, we are the original fans and that
Yeah,
kind of stuff.
yeah, I think that's an important note too, because like we're just like right in the thick of, a fandom evolution. It's probably, and we're not
Mm-hmm.
going to really know what it's going to look like until we're kind of on the other side of whatever era we're in right now. Um, Supernatural has a huge like fan base on Wattpad. I remember when I started, I hadn't watched the show, but I saw so much fan fiction that I was like, maybe I should watch this. Um, and like loved it, and I think like that is a show in particular that had such a good handle on what it meant to its fans and did a lot of fan service in the show. yeah, I think it's done like a really, really good job of setting kind of a template for, fan service in general and for an ongoing show, at least.
Yeah, I agree, especially since they still do conventions
Yeah.
all the time. And they are some of the best conventions I've ever been to are supernatural conventions because it is that
Hmm.
feeling like the actors actually care. It feels like that. Feels like you kind
Yeah.
of have that like they value their fans a lot. So
Hmm.
yeah.
And, 20 plus seasons of material. Like, there's just so
I
much to
know.
absorb there. Like, if you really want to have a good rewatch or first watch, like that's a great one to dive into.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of material there for sure. Yeah.
Hmm.
And then I'm just curious, do you have a favorite fandom for fanfic?
Oh my gosh. I don't, okay, I'm not going to call it a favorite, but I do have some formative ones for myself anyway. So, One Direction was I would say my professional gateway fandom. So when I started at Wattpad, that was obviously everywhere. It was 2015, so like, you know what time that was. And it was just One Direction all over the place. And so that one's quite precious to me because I think I spent so much time in that fandom and to understand fandom and how to work in this space. And I think it was quite formative for my own understanding of just like fan fiction in general, but also just fan behavior. And really, I just went down a rabbit hole and I love it. Um, but I'm like very fascinated by fandoms as they come and go. I mean, I've been in kind of the BTS fandom as well. I'm going to the concert on Saturday. I'm very excited. Um, but in general, like there's a lot of different fandoms and how they've kind of evolved that I find they're not favorites. I wouldn't call them a favorite, but I'm so fascinated by them. The Taylor Swift fandom I think is fascinating, especially for how transformative it's been in establishing kind of a benchmark for fan behavior in general. Like this really
Yeah.
is like it's so massive and it's so just like everywhere that it's kind of setting like the tone for all fandom and fan behavior like after it and how she engages with her fan base, I think is really fantastic. Like one of my anecdotes that I think is really interesting is there actually isn't a lot of Taylor Swift fanfic on Wattpad. And we were kind of my team and I were trying to figure out why that was because we're like, oh, she's like the biggest star in the world. Like, why wouldn't people be, writing fan fiction about her? But it's because her work is fan fiction of herself. Like she is the author of her own
Uh,
work and her own fan fiction, and that she's kind of like the the primary author of this space. And so like what could I do as a fan to add on to that? It's so like she has just huge like amount of content. You almost don't have any gaps that you could even fill in some way. And so like no one really deviates from her canon because she's developed this like very huge canon in some way. So I think that's really fascinating. Like that one is a one that I always keep track of because I think it's fascinating and just in general. And then maybe that connects to like music fandom as well. I think music fandom is, I mean, obviously you have Taylor Swift, you have BTS, you have One Direction, so there's a pattern here. But I find music fandom to be so interpretive because you're listening to something and there's usually a lot of storytelling within it, but it's not necessarily obvious all the time, depending on the artist. And I think that music fandom tends to overlap with celebrity culture pretty intensely, especially post Taylor Swift and all of
yeah.
her kind of the way that she approaches her storytelling in music. I think that's had definitely a ripple effect. Um, Phoebe Bridgers' new album came out, and so many of the songs are about her life, but it's like I don't think you have that type of dissection in her work without the way we've dissected Taylor Swift's work. So I don't know. I should write a thesis about this someday, but I do think music fandom is really fascinating, and I tend to really go in those spaces to be like, what's happening over here? Because it's very different. But in general, I mean, I'm obviously a fan of a lot of things. And I loved like Lord of the Rings growing up. Right now I'm like very invested in the new Interview with the Vampire series. And so of course I loved Supernatural. So yeah, I'm kind of an open book when it comes to favorites. I'm like I could be a favorite of a lot of things. I just need a little bit of time to absorb it all, I think.
Yeah, I know it's a hard question to definitely answer, I think, especially if you consume a lot of it and are around a lot of it. Um,
Totally.
and then what you mentioned about Taylor Swift, just really briefly, if you can answer it,
Mhm.
that made me think because that's kind of surprising to me that there isn't Taylor Swift fanfic or a lot of it.
Mhm.
Is there a fandom or something that you wish there was more fanfic of, or that
Oh,
you're even more shocked isn't out there?
that's actually a great question. No, because I find like I think it's the way that I look at fan fiction, at least in my job, my day to day, is it's such an interesting mirror to pop culture. It's an interesting space for us to look and see, like, okay, what do people care about? What's inspiring people in some way? And so that's kind of how I use it. So if there is a lot or isn't a lot, I find it's just like a really interesting curiosity for me to help inform the work that I do, to help understand creatives and what people are writing, what people are interested in, and kind of the just the heartbeat of pop culture in general. So I use it as a gateway for myself. Um, yeah, I think that that's probably mainly what I try to do and try to be as objective as possible when
Mhm.
I do that. Because like at least in my day to day, when I'm like off the clock, then I just kind of fangirl all day, every day about certain things. And I also have a very eclectic team that have amazing, wonderful, eclectic interests. So it's like really interesting for all of us to chat about the things that we're invested in and what we're seeing on the platform. Um, but no, I don't ever wish that there's more of something or less of something. It's more like, let's just see what is here in this very specific ecosystem of community and creativity, and then try to get some insight so that we can do our jobs better and we can, make sure that those who are on Wattpad, who are writing, putting their ideas and their art out there are feeling like that we're supporting them in some way and that we're really deeply understanding where they're coming from. That's really the purpose for me anyway.
I love that because I think even as fans, if you find a platform or a place to share, there can be times when you might feel like, I don't know, like disconnected from that platform, if that makes sense, like not
Mhm.
as welcomed in. So, yeah, I love that. So, thank
Yeah.
you. Well, thank you so much, Alessandra, for speaking with me. This was really, really interesting. I love talking about different various aspects of fanfic. And so, thank you for taking the time to speak with me. And if people don't know where Wattpad is or where they can find it, yeah, do you want to tell people?
Yeah, of course. Wattpad.com. There it is. You got to sign up. As long as you're over 13, you can sign up for Wattpad and start writing your stories. But once you're on Wattpad, if you are interested in connecting with communities and connecting with different spaces, I highly recommend we have a really wonderful ambassador program, which is a bunch of volunteers who are readers and writers, and they run these amazing profiles. So any genre you like, they have a horror profile and a fantasy profile. They also have a bunch of writing sprints that they do every single month and a lot of initiatives. So if you are a writer on Wattpad specifically and you're looking for some community, I would definitely look for our ambassadors. They're like at ambassadors on Wattpad. And take a look at what they're doing because they are phenomenal and they're in so many different languages, not even just English. And they are also a fanfic profile if you want to look for different fandoms. So that would be my first step that I would recommend is connecting with them and then seeing where it takes you.
Awesome. That's wonderful. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much again for joining me and speaking with us. And I really, really enjoyed this conversation. So
Yeah,
thank you so
thank
much.
you. It was
You're
my
welcome.
pleasure.